can hear me? Great. My name is Mark Wall. Thank you for coming. So I'm an architect at Microsoft on Forefront Identity Management, basically part of our Identity and Access Management product lines. What I'm going to be talking about today are some of the techniques that we're using internally within Microsoft that we've been researching and that some of our customers like yourselves are using to connect Forefront Identity Manager with Active Directory, other directory services, and a variety of different cloud offerings. Let's see if I can click. Great. So first I'm going to give a very brief introduction of Cloud Identity Management just to get all the terminology out of the way. Then primarily I'm going to be talking about three cloud scenarios. The first is management of virtual machines in a private cloud. Then I'm going to be talking about some of the techniques that could be applied using Forefront Identity Manager for getting ready for Office 365 and the Microsoft Business Productivity Online Services, and now the Office 365 variants of that. And then finally, I'm going to be talking through an example of how to use Forefront Identity Manager with Active Directory Federation services and Active Directory to construct claims for software as a service applications. So first, terminology. So you've probably seen 1,000 Microsoft slides, say what is the cloud, what's the value, and so on. I'm just going to skip through all of this very quickly. Primarily thinking, though, from an identity angle, what are the identity implications of each of the models of the cloud? When we think about infrastructure and platform as a service in particular, often what we think of as identity management and identity platform implementers at Microsoft is primarily around the issue of control. Thinking about infrastructure and platform, what are the interfaces that they provide to the rest of the organization? What are the interfaces that they provide to tenants within the service? It might be the ability for someone to provide their own virtual machine or to provide their own application and have that run on a third-party hosted or IT-hosted virtual machine or physical machine. So a lot of the interfaces that we think of from an identity perspective are all around who controls this information, who controls these services, who is able to affect them, what are the capabilities that the infrastructure itself needs in order to ensure that control is provided to the right people, that random unauthorized users can't get in and get at the underlying databases, get at the underlying disks of a virtual machine. Software as a service we see as having a much richer set of interfaces around identity. And when I talk about the role of identity and access management for the cloud, I'm going to be looking at infrastructure and platform, but then really focusing on what are some of the key problems and challenges that we see from software as a service as it relates to the use of identity. Now look at the landscape. I'm going to be talking about kind of three different areas where the cloud might exist or might be implemented. First, I'm going to be talking about a private cloud scenario down in the lower right-hand corner where an organization might take some portion of its physical systems and say, these are a private cloud. These are physical machines. We've bought some new servers. We have a new disk array. We're going to declare this as a cloud to the rest of the organization and basically operate it as a service to say, here is infrastructure. Various divisions, various groups can bring their own virtual machines. Accounting can show up with the accounting servers and say, yes, we'd like to run this as part of your platform, get it backed up, get it maintained, and so on. I'm next going to be talking about a Microsoft-hosted public cloud scenario, Office 365. And then I'm going to be talking about a third-party cloud scenario in which an organization might be signing up to a service that's operated by someone, either a partner, a public hosted service, or something that might be initially operated on premises but then moved up into a public cloud like Azure or one of the other services from, say, Amazon or VMware or someone else. Now, when you think about the use of identity, kind of focus on these four aspects. The first is making sure that applications have enough information to give a good user experience. When we work with the Office 365 teams within Microsoft, a lot of the focus that we see as the drivers for identity for Office 365 is preserving the user experience, particularly for organizations that are moving from having on-premises Exchange or SharePoint servers to having those same experiences be available hosted by Microsoft in the Microsoft Cloud. And so one of the first drivers that we see is making sure that the same user experiences that are available to users on premises are there in the cloud as well. The second is, of course, authentication. If you've been working in identity for any number of time, you'll know that the first question that an application developer has is, how am I going to authenticate the users? Do I have my own separate database with passwords for everyone? I have to go keep track of that myself. Can I rely upon something else? Can I rely upon Active Directory? Can I rely upon someone else to deal with authentication? And just tell me, this is an authorized user. This really is Mark Wall. This really is someone. The next question, though, is we often find talking to application developers is they focus so much time on authentication problem. How do I know this is really who they say they are? That authorization is now getting to be the primary challenge. In order for an application to be able to express a policy of who is able to make a change to this data, who is able to see this data, oftentimes for an application developer we talk to, they say the first thing we want to do is just figure out who are the users of the system and what can they do? What can Mark do with this application? Can I say that when Mark creates a record, maybe it's a Salesforce automation application, when Mark creates a record for a new customer, he's able to manage that customer record. He's able to go in and see the customer history, track it, find out the phone number, and so on. But then the authorization questions start to creep in. Well, what happens if Mark leaves? What happens if he's no longer there to keep track of this customer? Who should be responsible for this customer record? How does it get reassigned? Do we assign it to his manager? Do we assign it to someone else in his group? Do we have a policy in place that if Mark's unavailable, he's at a conference someplace, someone else needs to look at that record? Can he delegate that control to someone else? There's a lot of questions around authorization that we're still working out for the cloud models. The final issue is the collaboration use of identity, the ability to leverage the information that's being provided for personalizing applications, for authenticating users, for authorizing them, and be able to unlock new collaboration scenarios. Within Office 365, we have a number of identity elements that are used to enable collaboration. Simple things like the global address list or mailing list for collaboration. Link is doing a lot of work on enabling cross-organization collaboration. And we also see some new techniques going into SharePoint Online for enabling more collaboration between users in different organizations, be able to easier manage access by people who are not employees or contractors who are members of the public and so on. So I'm going to be talking about some of the identity implications from these on the cloud scenarios. Now, the first question that we often then get is, where does the identity management reside? Suppose we say, yes, we're going to use the cloud, whatever that happens to mean. The next question will then be, where do we relate identity and access management to the operator of that cloud? One option would be to have whoever's running the cloud also be responsible for running the identity. So, classic example for this, you sign up for Salesforce.com, let's say. If you're a small business, you go to Salesforce.com, they'll probably say, great, welcome to Salesforce.com. You can go and create sales records. You can also create a list of all your employees who have access to sales information. So that's the first option, using whatever the cloud service provider gives to you. Another option would be to synchronize data that you already have on premises, let's say in Active Directory or in Sun Directory or Lotus Dominant or something, into the cloud so that you're still managing your data on premises, but it's available up to a cloud application. So that's one thing we're going to talk through for an Office 365 scenario, the relationship of identity management on-premise, synchronization, and a cloud provider. The third and fourth options are being able to federate information. And in a federated model, an organization maintains its own identity, perhaps on-premise or perhaps with a trusted third party, and then uses those identities kind of more dynamically to one or more cloud service providers. So that's an option also with Office 365. I'll talking through the implications of that. What does it mean to federate and synchronize? When does an organization choose to use one or another? Primarily, I'll be focusing on the second and fourth option. How do we think about getting data ready for synchronization? How do we think about getting data ready for federation? Now, the technology I'm going to be using for this is Forefront Identity Manager 2010, which came out last year. The way in which I think about Forefront Identity Manager is it's there to make sure that applications have the right data, to make sure that identity data is of appropriate quality. The way it does that is it enforces a number of policies and processes that an organization might express in order to ensure that data ends up in Active Directory or Sun Directory or a SQL database that is appropriate quality, is appropriately controlled to make sure that an application that's going and hitting Active Directory and making queries, knows that it's going to get good data. So how does it actually do that? Well, the first component of Forefront Identity Manager is synchronization. You can express synchronization policy. This is something that customers who've been using the predecessor products like ILM or MIS or MMS have been doing for a very long time. An organization might say, yes, we've got Active Directory, but we also have some applications that are using Sun Directory, or we have some applications that are using Lotus Notes. We have some applications that rely upon a SQL database, has a table of users in that database. How do we make sure that we don't have different lists of users in each of these different databases and systems? So Forefront Identity Manager can provide that capability. You can say, for example, that you want to have the same list of users in Active Directory as you have in Sun Directory. Or you can say that you want to have the same groups that are visible in Lotus Domino as are visible in Exchange. The second purpose is just a way of thinking about synchronization around automated provisioning and deprovisioning. One of the capabilities that we added in Forefront Identity Manager 2010 was the ability to write provisioning and deprovisioning rules to say, for example, that when a new employee is detected in the SAP system, then we'll automatically create an account for them in Active Directory. And when we see that that user has been disabled or deleted in SAP, then we'll go through and terminate their Active Directory account. So this is primarily important to make sure that you don't have leftover accounts. You don't have legacy accounts still in the directory, still in those databases for users who are no longer in the system. This is going to be particularly important when we start talking about the cloud for a couple of reasons. The first is you don't want people who have left the organization still have access to cloud services. And secondly, you don't want to keep paying those cloud service providers for accounts if it's a per user license for users who are no longer ever going to be accessing the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about Forefront Identity Manager and its ability to manage user life cycles for provisioning, for deprovisioning, and what that means for cloud license management. Another capability in Forefront Identity Manager 2010 that we added in that version is we provide a couple of end user experiences. So we provide experiences for users to reset their passwords, for users to manage their own membership of groups, for a user to manage creating and deleting their own groups. So a user can go to a portal and say, I'd like to create a mailing list, and I'd like to go and put my friends on it. This is a big cost savings for many organizations because people don't have to call the help desk for traditional day-to-day identity management tasks. You don't have to call help desk to say, I forgot my password, or I'd like to join this group of people who like cats because I like cats. You can go and give the users the ability to do this themselves through Forefront Identity Manager. Now we're going to use this technique in some of these scenarios to think about how do we extend the self-service experiences in order to help make sure we have good, clean, quality data in Active Directory for Office 365 and also for some new claims-based applications. The final capability of Forefront Identity Manager is managing the life cycle of smart cards and certificates so that users have the ability to authenticate with something stronger than a password. For many applications on premises, it really depends on, do you have regulatory drivers, do you have security drivers for using stronger authentication. Some of our customers have said to us, one of their concerns for the cloud is making sure that the cloud doesn't introduce new vulnerability points that would expose their data at more risk than what they have on premises. So I've said, for example, that passwords may be sufficient for users who are on premises, users who are accessing their systems from within the data center. But what happens when those applications are up in the cloud and there's a cloud service somewhere with a web portal that allows people to go to it and say, enter your username and password? One thing that's great about the cloud is dynamic scalability. You've heard a lot about that in all the other tracks about how the cloud will scale magically to support any load you place on it. So that means any load, whether it's a legitimate load or a password guessing attack load. If someone's out there trying to guess users' passwords and submitting thousands of password authentication attempts per second, will your cloud service dynamically scale and eventually allow that user to quickly and efficiently have their password cracked? For customers who are worried about things like that, they say, well, maybe we want to think about having a stronger authentication mechanism for the cloud-based service. Maybe we don't want the cloud-based services to be relying upon passwords. Maybe what we'd like to have is a software certificate or some other device, or just have a claim that comes up that only comes from on-premises systems that says this is a legitimate user, so that there is no external portal up in the cloud that's ever asking a user for their password. So now I'm going to talk about those three scenarios. The first scenario I'm going to talk through is a private cloud scenario using System Center Virtual Machine Manager and Forefront Identity Manager. Then I'm going to talk about two scenarios for public cloud. The first is some of the questions that we get, some of the issues that we run into when we talk to customers who are thinking about BPOS or deployed BPOS and are now looking at Office 365 that are considering moving to that, and how do they get ready for that process. And then third, I'm going to talk about how do we enable new applications, claims-aware applications, applications that might be in the cloud. In particular, how do we look at using FIM in order to allow those applications to get the data they need without having to modify your on-premises Active Directory. So let's start with the private cloud scenario. So how do we manage infrastructure as a service? Well, here at Microsoft, we have two technologies for that. The first is Windows Server Hyper-V. You probably all use this. Comes with Windows Server. It's a server role managed through MMC. Probably a very familiar tool. Another tool that we provide in the System Center family, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Now, Hyper-V is primarily focused on managing one physical server at a time. You go log into that server. I've got one running over here, and I can manage all the virtual machines on that server. If I want to manage a whole big rack of servers, and I want to be able to say that I have virtual machines that could run on any of those servers, Virtual Machine Manager is primarily focused on that scenario. And one thing that Virtual Machine Manager offers above Hyper-V that I find very exciting is their self-service web portal. This is a component that allows an organization's IT department to say, we want to be responsible for maintaining the physical servers. We want to be responsible for making sure that they have power and air conditioning and network connectivity and so on. But we want to allow users throughout the rest of the organization that have their own virtual machines to run their virtual machines on our servers. And we don't want them to have to call us every time they want to do something to their virtual machine. We don't want someone who's over in, let's say, accounting, who wants to try out something, to have to call us up in the IT department and say, yeah, I want a VM with like 4 gig of RAM and 100 gig of disk, because I want to try something out. It may or may not work. Just, I got some software. It sounds cool. I want to try it. We can give those users who are skilled IT users but outside the core IT department an experience for them to create their own virtual machines, to manage them, start them, stop them, do whatever they need to do with their virtual machines through the web portal. Now let's talk about how these applications deal with authentication, authorization, and so on. Well, because they're Microsoft products that are well behaved, of course they're going to use Active Directory for authentication. Of course they will. Now Hyper-V, how do we think about authorization? It uses ASMAN, which has been around for quite some time. They're in Windows. And ASMAN is a MMC snap-in. You may not have ever noticed it's on your machine. It's not very visible within Windows Server or within the Administrative Tools menu. But if you bring up MMC, you can go into the ASMAN Authorization Manager console and bring up the configuration for Hyper-V. Now, one thing you can do with this is you can provide, even within a single physical system, even just within Windows itself, finer-grained authorization to different functions within Hyper-V. So you might say, for example, that I want to allow certain people in my organization to be able to start and stop virtual machines because they need to be able to do scheduled backups and things like that, or they may be the help desk staff who have to handle the late night call, someone saying, help, my VM is crashed, can you go back to a snapshot or do something to it? And one thing you can do with Authorization Manager is define roles and then assign users to those roles and then map them into what permissions within Hyper-V each of those roles have. So you might say, for example, that you have an administrator role within Hyper-V that allows administrators, domain admins, to do anything. Probably don't want to limit what a domain administrator can do. But you might create an additional role to say, I want to have a role that is just help desk. And I want to allow users in that role to be able to start virtual machines, stop them, do some basic configuration. But I don't want users in the help desk role to create virtual machines or to reconfigure the network, the virtual network settings for my Hyper-V system, because the odds of them doing that and creating a virtual machine and we come in a week later, it's like, whose VM is this? Where did it come from? We're going to limit the ability for help desk to do that. You can express those through Authorization Manager. And what you can do with Authorization Manager is back each of these roles by an Active Directory security group. So you could declare a security group of help desk staff, Authorization Manager, you create a role saying help desk for this system in Hyper-V, and now anyone who goes in is a member of that security group. When they bring up the Hyper-V console, they'll only be able to do the functions that are appropriate for their role. Now that's fairly simple, easy to do, but it has, of course, a couple of limitations. The first thing is, this is something you have to do with Authorization Manager on every single Hyper-V host, which doesn't scale very well. Secondly is that the users are going to be interacting with Hyper-V, of course, through the Hyper-V console, which means that they need to be IT pros. They need to have that console installed on their system. They need to be able to log into Hyper-V directly or to be able to get at Hyper-V over the network. And that just may not be appropriate for some categories of users. So a lot of those limitations are removed with System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Now here, we have the same role-based model. We can declare, for example, if you see on the right, a list of different permissions. And you can say that, who's allowed to start and stop machines. You can group those into roles. Now, for each role, there are 3 different profiles that come out of the box with Virtual Machine Manager. You can't add new profiles, but you can add new roles. And the 3 profiles are basically the different categories of roles. Administrator profile is the kind of thing you give to a domain administrator. You can do anything. You can control every single function of Virtual Machine Manager. Probably it doesn't make much sense to add more roles to the administrator profile. Where it does make sense are the other 2 profiles. Delegated administrator profile is the ability to say, I want to take the administrative powers and limit them only to certain hosts or only to certain servers. Now, one way in which you could think about using the delegated administrator profile and roles based on that would be for, let's say, geographic limitations or for data protection. To say, I want to give the users who are based in Europe the ability to control any of the VMs that are hosted on the European Hyper-V host. And the people who are coming in from Asia, they can control the Asia ones. The people from US who control the US ones. This gives you some degree of isolations. The simple right of being an administrator and the ability to start and stop a European host doesn't give you any power to start and stop a host based in Asia. But you can do anything you want to your servers when you have the delegated administrator profile. The third profile, self-service users, this is for users who are going to come into the web-based portal. These are for users who are probably not day-to-day IT staff, day-to-day system administrators. These are users who have intermittent need for controlling virtual machines. To say, I'm a tester, I'm developing my own internal applications, or I'm in charge of evaluating new technology, and I get this virtual machine image in from some third party. I need to slap it on a physical host, take it for a spin, see if it's any good, if we're going to buy it or not. These are users, you can create roles for them with the self-service profile. Now, the interesting thing for this is you can then specify fine-grained limits on what users can do with the self-service profile. You can say, for example, that this user with this profile is only able to control virtual machines that are assigned to a particular library image. So you can say, for example, that users are able to go in and create any virtual machine they want based on a particular well-known Windows Server image, or based on a Linux image, or some other image that's in your image library. You can also limit how users can control each other's machines. So for example, if you give a user the ability, by putting them in a role that's in the self-service profile, to create a virtual machine, that user can come in, create a virtual machine. No one else in the organization, unless their administrator, can touch their VM. So that gives them some degree of isolation. But what if that user leaves? What if they want to say, well, I want anyone in my team to have access to it? What they can do then is they can assign the ownership of their virtual machine, rather than to themselves, to a security group. Now they can say anyone who's in the security group can have access to my virtual machine. They can start it, stop it, back it up, so that if I leave or if I'm on vacation, someone else on my team can control this. So as soon as we heard this capability coming in a Virtual Machine Manager, we started thinking, wow, this is great, because over in the identity side in FIM, we have the ability to do self-service management of security groups. So this we see as a really powerful technique that we've been talking about to a number of customers, where you can use the Virtual Machine Manager and its self-service portal in order to control access to virtual machines, and you can use Forefront Identity Manager and its portal to control the membership of security groups. So this combination we see organizations looking at to say, when someone joins the organization and they're in, let's say, the accounting department, and their title coming in from SAP or the other HR system said that they're an IT professional or they've completed some training, then we can automatically put them through FIM into a security group. And that'll give them access to any of the virtual machines that are managed in the accounting team. We can also provide through FIM self-service experiences so that, say, the head of the accounting department can go and say, well, I'd like to grant additional users access. Maybe we have some contractors. I'd like to put them in a security group. And they can do that through the FIM portal. Those changes take effect in Active Directory. System Center Virtual Machine Manager looks at Active Directory, looks at those security group memberships in order to give the users access to their virtual machines. The key thing is thinking about the combination of SCVMM in its portal and FIM in its portal as basically eliminating calls to the help desk. By combining these two technologies, a department outside of core IT can manage its own virtual machines. They can control who has access, who can start them, who can stop them, can create them, delete them, back them, do whatever they need to do, and never have to call help desk, never have to send an email, raise a trouble ticket. They can do that management themselves. And if they decide that they want to give a contractor access, if they decide that some rogue user is out there evaluating new technology without official approval, they can control that themselves and not need to get IT involved. So this combination, using the security groups based on the roles, we think is pretty powerful because these are techniques that are available in the two products themselves. You don't have to go and customize FIM. You don't have to go customize SCVMM. Those capabilities are there by default. So let's just see some examples for how we do this. I've got demos on here, but just in the interest of time, I'll kind of flip through for screenshots. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the FAT client console of System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And within the administration tab, we can see that there are the three profiles: administrator, delegated admin, and self-service user. And within these three profiles, there's an administrator role by default, and I've gone through and created additional roles. The delegated admin roles, VMM operators and perimeter operators, are there to allow different users in my help desk organization to start and stop VMs or make network changes. So there might be a perimeter operator who is someone who's there in the security function, who, if they see there's an attack late at night or something weird going on in the network, they can go into SCVMM and reconfigure the virtual network settings without needing to be a full domain administrator. They can say, I don't know what this VM is doing, it looks odd, take its network connection down. The self-service user profile, I've created 3 profiles underneath that for users who are intermittent IT consumers. Self-service access. This is for someone to be able to say, I'm an administrator, but I also want to try going through the portal to see what users see. Maybe I have my own VMs I'm just playing with in my sandbox. The application owner's profile is for people who come to the organization and say, I'm going to show up with my own application. I've got this VM that my ISV gave to me. I want to run it on a system. I'm just going to run it myself. And so we create a role for them in a self-service profile, back it by a security group that basically says, anyone in the organization can be in that role. And then we created a third role called testers, and the testers role is backed by a security group that says anyone who is in the testing organization can create their own VMs, and we can allow them to share that amongst themselves. So one tester might say, yeah, I want to give another tester access, and they can do that by assigning the testers security group ownership of their virtual machine, so any of them can see each other's machines. So what does that look like behind the scenes? So here's the role definition for the perimeter operator, and we can see that it has basically 3 aspects to the configuration. So the name of it, what role in this profile, in this case it's delegated administrator, and then we can set for that the membership. So we can go into Active Directory and pick a security group, in this case VMM perimeter operators, that is appropriate security group for this role. We can do a similar thing for the self-service user. We can back this by a particular security group. We can determine what permissions that users have. So we might, for example, say that the users aren't able to do any network configuration for their own applications. We might say that they're just stuck using the internal network, but they can create their own VMs. They can become administrator on the VMs. They can start and stop them however they need to. And then similarly for testers. So here we can see what the portal experience would be for someone coming in to the self-service portal from a tester's role. We see up in the top, when they go try to create a virtual machine, it tells them, you are a tester, and because of that, we've configured what they're able to do. They're only able to use certain well-defined templates, certain well-defined virtual machine images in order to create their new VMs. They can create application servers, they can create clients, and that's it. Testers can't bring their own VMs into the environment. Okay, any questions at this point? Great. So now let's talk about our next scenario, using identities with Office 365. So within Office 365, there's 3 ways in which we can think about managing identities. The first one is to just let Office 365 take care of everything. When you sign up for Office 365, if you're a small business, if you're a 10-person company, you don't have Active Directory on premises, you don't need Active Directory. You go to Office 365, you sign up and say, I'm just going to go use their web portal, create my users, give them passwords, everything resides in the cloud. If you're a larger 300,000 person company, that probably is not going to be your best option. In which case, you can use directory synchronization. In directory synchronization, there's two ways of thinking about this depending on where the credentials reside. One option would be that you're going to use your identities that you maintain on premises. Maybe you've got users already in Active Directory or in some database or in SAP, and you want to send those users up into the cloud. But you don't want to have the same passwords for users in the cloud as what you have on premises. Maybe your password rules are different. Maybe you have users who just, they want to have a different password, or maybe you just don't want to have to deal with password management right now, and you just want to say, if you're using the cloud, they should go and have their own experience in the cloud. A third option would be to use directory synchronization, so that users have their accounts sent from Active Directory or your system on premises up to the cloud, but you don't want to have users have a separate credential in the cloud. You want users to be able to authenticate once on premise and not have to be re-authenticated when they connect to the cloud. This has certain advantages of the federation model because then you can control your own password policies or use your own authentication token, whether it's smart cards or software certificates or something else, and not have to worry about users being able to get in through the back door with a password guessing attack to a cloud-based service. But of course, there are downsides of this one because with the federation approach, you need to have servers for your organization that are able to do the user authentication. Because you're not relying upon the cloud to authenticate users, your servers now have to be highly available, highly accessible to your user community. So if we look at how this exists in the environment, for the second and third model in which you've got users already on premises and you want to send them to Office 365, we have a component called Microsoft Online Directory Synchronization that you get when you sign up for BPOS and now when you sign up for Office 365. And what it does is it takes data from Active Directory and sends it up to the provisioning platform so that it's available for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Lync Online, and so on. And there's a whole session here, I think it's later today or it might be tomorrow, just about the DIRSync component. It walks through that in a lot of detail. So I'm not going to go through the DIRSync component now. What I'm going to primarily be focused on is the part down at the bottom, Forefront Identity Manager, and how we get the right data in Active Directory so that the DIRSync component can send it up to the cloud, and that if you want to use federation, Active Directory Federation services can also use that information for authenticating users for the cloud. So there's kind of 4 phases we see for getting users signed up and running in the cloud for Office 365. And here are the key things from an identity perspective. There is a lot of documentation that we have out there for BPOS and now for Office 365 that I'm going to provide some links to later in the deck that talk through the planning phase of how do you get your directory information, how do you get your infrastructure ready for Office 365. Then in this talk, I'm going to be talking about the preparing step. How do you make sure that the data you have in Active Directory is appropriate for DIRSync to be able to take it and send it up to the cloud? Once you have that, maybe you're turning on federations, then you can go and license users, and users are able to access the services. So one question we get a lot is, what's the relationship between Forefront Identity Manager and the Microsoft Online DIRSync component? If you've tried BPOS already, and you've got the DIRSync component, and you've installed it and poked around under the covers, you'll see that it's actually an earlier version of Identity Manager hiding underneath there. And it's basically an appliance package. Today, DIRSync and FIM are completely separate. Now, this is something that is I would say, a historical anomaly rather than a design goal. And over time, we're going to bring those closer together so that if you're using FIM, you may not need to have a separate DIRSync in the future. You can have those capabilities from Forefront Identity Manager. But today, with Office 365, as it becomes widely available, and with BPOS today, FIM is just going to put the data into Active Directory. DIRSync is going to take the users, the contacts, the DLs, and now security groups and send them up into Office 365. And if you want federation, ADFS takes care of the user authentication part. So the key things to think about today is that today, FIM does not talk to Office 365. We don't have a management agent. We don't have a connector into Office 365. DIRSync is our supported technique for connecting to that. And secondly, FIM doesn't get involved in the user authentication process at all. If you're going to be federating, if you're going to be connecting users to the cloud with federation such that they authenticate on premises, and then those credentials are managed on-prem, and only claims go to the cloud, ADFS handles all of that. And there's configuration tools that come with Office 365 to help set up ADFS. So how do we think about the role for FIM? Is there a purpose for FIM in the Office 365 deployment? And I think there is, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first is FIM helps you go through and categorize the users within your organization. Oftentimes when we look at organizations that are planning a move from, let's say, Exchange to Exchange Online, their first question is, well, of all my mailboxes, now that they're going to be in the cloud, they're going to be licensed as cloud services, I'm going to be paying CALs for each of these and it's going to be tracked. Do I really need to license all these users? We also have scenarios where they say, well, great, I'm going to move my end users up into the cloud, but I have certain mailboxes that I need to keep on premises because they're tied to some application that's running on premises, or they're for a user, and the user just doesn't want to have that cloud experience. Maybe they're locked in the basement of the data center, they don't want to get out the cloud. Okay, for those users, they'll continue to be in an Exchange on-premises system. So now when you think about DirSync, your question is, well, who's going to be synced up to the cloud? And then when those user accounts are synced up into Office 365, who's going to be licensed? And FIM, with its notions of managing users and determining the life cycle and determining which users are in which category. You can define different sets of users based on their attributes, based on different parameters of them. There's a lot of capabilities in FIM for user categorization. Now, another useful purpose for FIM that we see a number of customers doing is they use FIM to populate Active Directory based on some authoritative data source. So they've got SAP, they've got a database, they've got a feed that they get, a file from their HR provider every day, every week, every month, whatever it happens to be, that says, here are all your official users. And they say, this is great because now we can say through FIM, every time a user shows up in this file, I want to automatically get them a mailbox. So you can configure in FIM to automatically provision the user into Active Directory. DirSync will then send that user up into the cloud so that they'll be an Exchange Online. And you can also use FIM to drive reports, to drive output, text files and so on that you can then use to drive the licensing function of Office 365. So you can automatically license users. Another use for FIM that many of our educational customers in particular are looking at is to migrate from a non-Exchange environment and even a non-Active Directory environment to the cloud. So you have organizations that say, we've got Domino on-premise today, and we kind of want to go to Exchange Online, but we don't want to have to first deploy Exchange and then migrate users to Exchange Online. All the documentation that I'm getting from Microsoft Office 365 is all about this Exchange migration. We don't have Exchange. So one of the capabilities that organizations use FIM for is to handle putting together an Active Directory that's only there to migrate users to the cloud. It's not a standard user authentication step, but it's there in order to stage up the data that's coming from a non-Active Directory system. If you've got Domino directory, if you've got OpenLDAP, Sun directory, Oracle directory, whatever it happens to be, and you want to get those users into the cloud, FIM and a staging Active Directory can help with that process. And then a final purpose that organizations are using FIM for with Office 365 is force consolidation. Today, the DirSync appliance, effectively, that comes from Microsoft Online will only handle a single forest. If you're a multi-forest organization and you may say, well, I want to continue being multi-forest, then you have a lot bigger challenge in how do you think about adopting Office 365. Some organizations have said, well, we're multi-forest, but we're multi-forest by accident rather than by design. And so they can look at using FIM to perform that forest consolidation, to get the data from each of their forests into a single forest, get that data clean, and then once it's available, then they can synchronize it up using Microsoft Online DirSync into Office 365. So that's a technique that's also possible for the multi-forest organizations. So when we think about the process of getting the user data, we kind of divide it into three phases. The first phase is making sure we've identified who are the users of the system, which accounts need to be in the cloud. Oftentimes, organizations are looking at using Fortified Identity Manager to ensure that they have a process to go through and flag orphan accounts, dormant accounts. They go through and say, who are the users who just don't need to be in the cloud? there's a lot of capabilities within FIM to make this a self-service experience. To say, for example, I want to provide a web portal to all my line managers to allow them to go through and see the user accounts that have them as a manager. And they can go and look at those accounts and say, oh, well, these are accounts that should be in the cloud. And if they see something that's like, oh, there's a user and he left a month ago, or there's a contract, we don't need to give them a license, they have a way of reviewing that. Asking them to go to Active Directory directly, so, okay, managers, bring up 80 users and computers and start trawling through your OU structure is a lot less friendly. So the FIM portal gives users a lot of capabilities to be able to see data, to be able to review the information during the planning phases of Office 365. Another thing that organizations do, as I mentioned earlier, is use the FIM concepts of sets in order to categorize users. They'll go into FIM and they'll create a new attribute, an attribute of, is licensed for cloud or is not licensed for cloud. And they can then have a review process to ask each department head or each department manager to say, go through and review your users. You're going to be charged. We're going to back charge your department for everyone. We're going to have an attribute of department code on every user that we're syncing to the cloud. And if users don't have this attribute, then they won't have email anymore. If they do, you're going to have to pay for it. And you can use the FIM experience to provide the ability for users to review this information. They can look at their own profile through FIM. They can see this information. They can make sure the department code is accurate. They can request a change and say, oh, I'm in the wrong department. I should fix this now before I get deprovisioned out of email. So these capabilities of using FIM to provide a self-service data cleaning experience is, I think, a lot of power. Even if you're not using the self-service experience on the day-to-day group management, it helps a lot during this migration phase. Another capability that organizations are looking at using with FIM is to help with the data management problem. We see a lot of questions that organizations have when they first started signing up for BPOS with their existing Active Directory, because they would have data in their AD that was fine for Exchange, but Exchange Online was a lot stricter in terms of what data can be sent to the cloud. So if you look at the deployment guide, there's an Office 365 deployment guide. Appendix D of that document, definitely worth a read, or at least a skim, because it walks through a lot of the constraints that Office 365 has. Now, if you've got data in Active Directory that doesn't meet this constraint, and you try to run the DirSync appliance and synchronize that data up into Office 365, you're going to run into problems. DirSync appliance is going to say, data validation error. If it can't fix it, what's going to happen? Users won't be synchronized in the cloud. They're not going to be in the Exchange Online GAL. They're not going to be licensed for email. And because it's an appliance, it's not the kind of thing where you can go and look and say, oh, yeah, I'm just going to watch, keep an eye on it, get a report from it, get email notifications, SMP traps, whatever it happens to be. So going through and getting that data clean before you even turn on the appliance, before you even start that synchronization is really important. So what kind of things do we see customers run into a lot? Duplicates, very, very big problem. You say, everyone has an email address in my organization, but oftentimes we see through merger and acquisition or through people being reassigned or people asking for and getting accounts in multiple domains that there's going to be users in multiple domains who have the same email address. It may be the same person, but because they're different accounts, DirSync thinks it's two different users. Now, if two different users, same email mailbox, that's going to be a problem and tries to move them into Exchange Online because it says, well, which user should get this mailbox? They both have it. These are the kinds of errors you need to check for in Active Directory before you have the data goes up in the cloud. Proxy addresses, we sometimes see situations where a user has had a mailbox for a while and then they get a name change or someone more senior comes in and says, I really want that alias, you have to get a new alias. So they change their mailbox, but they still have their old proxy address attribute or still have another attribute that has their older mailbox. Then, of course, DirSync is going to run, try to send that up in the cloud, populate Exchange Online's proxy address attribute and says, two users with the same proxy address, must be an error. Duplicate account names, we've seen that a couple times. UPNs, I've got a whole slide on that one. We also see a number of situations where there's been data that's been in the directory for, in some cases, years and years, that hasn't really had a problem until they first start turning on some new online services. Like someone back in 2001 made an ASP application that allowed users to self-register. Fill in this form, hit return, it'll go create an account for you in AD. Use ADSI APIs, great, wonderful in-house application. Maybe they forgot to call string.trim on that, and what happened is users type in, create a new user, mark wall space return, and a user got populated as their display name attribute in an Active Directory with a space at the end or a space in the beginning. Now, if you look at this user with 80 users and computers, they look normal. Yeah, that's Mark Wall. When DirSync is going and trying to match up that user, you see the space at the end. You try to match it up to other data. It's like, 2 different account names, 2 different domain names, 2 different display names. Must be 2 different users, but they look the same. So trailing spaces, it's little things like that that are often gotchas we've seen in a number of customer sites. So using FIM, using some of the capabilities to export data from FIM in different formats, to be able to go through and say, everyone in this set, I want to provision into going out into an output file, maybe a CSV file or a text file or an LDIF file or into a SQL database so I can go and process this data, start reducing down the number of errors. And looking for the constraints, definitely read that appendix guide. Make sure you have the attributes you need. I've listed here 4 attributes that everyone has to have present. If you don't have the username, first, last, display name, various of the cloud services won't work. And of course, there's more things you could put into Active Directory if you want to through FIM. You could give self-service experiences, allow users to go to FIM and say, oh, I'd like to put in my address or my home phone number through FIM. If they put the data in through FIM, it goes into AD, it gets synced up into Exchange Online, now it shows up in the GAL. User principal names are particularly important if you're going to be doing federation. And there's a couple talks this week again on the federation, on how federation and the cloud work together. I'm just going to focus on the data management issue because these are the kinds of things where if you don't fix them now, and you have UPNs for users, as soon as you turn on federation and users whose UPNs don't match these restrictions can't get their email anymore, they're going to call help desk and say, I can't get that email anymore. And you say, oh, your UPN is wrong. We have to give you a new account name. And they'll say, but I like my account name. I've been using it for so long. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? I could have started memorizing my new account name. So these are the kinds of things. If you're thinking about Office 365, maybe a few months from now, start scanning for these issues. The attribute issues in Appendix D, and these restrictions on what characters can be in the user principal names, so that if you have users whose account names, whose UPNs don't match these letters, they've got weird characters, they've got weird dots in strange places, they got an insanely long UPN because they're masochists and they like typing, or they accidentally put in their password as their account name and now they have $signs and asterisks in them. These are the kinds of things you can go and tell the user, look, you're going to have to change your account name, so get ready now, start learning your new account name so that when we turn on the cloud, when we turn on federation, you don't have to change at that point when you're already worried, already feeling nervous about it. Groups. So the DirSync appliance will also send groups up into the cloud. It'll read all the users, all the groups out of Active Directory and send them up to the cloud. With BPOS, the earlier version, it would send up the mail groups, distribution list, mail-enabled security groups. If you're using SharePoint Online, it's also going to send up your security groups because you might be using SharePoint Online backed by security groups to control access to SharePoint Online sites. So if you have security groups in there that you don't feel comfortable about having in the cloud that are just laying around from previous acquisitions that went sour or various regulatory compliance activities that you've done, and you just don't think these security groups belong around anymore, now's a good time to clean them up. Because if you wait until you turn on DirSync and now they get synced up in the cloud, now they're going to start showing up more visibly across the organization than perhaps you had wanted to previously. Another important capability to think about you can do with FIM and with a number of other tools is to make sure that when you have groups going up to the cloud, that the members are also going to go into the cloud. We've run into this situation a number of times where the group has been working fine on premises. Users are able to get the mail. Their users are able to get access to a SharePoint site that's backed by a security group. But then the group moves into the cloud, Exchange Online or SharePoint Online using the group, but the user isn't licensed for the cloud service, and so they no longer have access. And this creates bad user experiences. But I used to have access. Why did you remove my access? Well, we didn't. You're still in the group. And if you went and looked at the group in the cloud, you'd see the users there. But if the user is not licensed for the service, if they're not licensed for SharePoint Online, then they're just not going to be able to get at that site at all. So going through and looking for these issues before the group synchronization occurs helps to catch a lot of these errors. Another important thing that customers are using Forefront Identity Manager for as part of the group management phase is to make sure that groups have owners. While group owner isn't a required attribute of Office 365 applications, it's really important to get the group ownership identified, because if you do run into one of these problems, if you do run into a situation where there's a group and you're not sure if the security implications, shall we say, of it are appropriate for Office 365, if you're not sure if the membership is right, if you've got people in there who are contractors, you've got computer accounts, system accounts in a security group, you need to be able to find out who to go and contact, who is the owner for that. So many of our customers that we talk to are looking at Forefront Identity Manager and similar technologies to provide a self-service experience for users to go and claim their security groups, to go through and prune out security groups that are no longer needed anymore, find security groups whose memberships are way out of date, and to get data clean as part of this data migration process. Office 365, even though it's not going to require this information, it often we found is a good forcing function to encourage organizations to go back and revisit the data that's been building up in Active Directory and say, we're going to be paying more for this data if it's bad data in the cloud. We're going to be paying more in cost, we're going to be paying more in maintenance, and we have users who are just going to have to license to the cloud because we don't know if they need an account or not. That's just money down the drain. So we see this as a good data cleaning phase for users and groups. Once you've got the data in Active Directory that's clean, then it's the time for the DirtSync compliance. You turn on the DirtSync compliance, and it'll take the data that's in your on-premises AD that you've either put there from SAP, you put there by syncing it in from Notes or from another directory or database, you've got there through self-service, and now it's synced up in the cloud. Now I'm going to talk about our third scenario, which is how do we think about identity management and new applications? So first, let's start with a very quick overview of claims-based identity and the two main components for that. In the claims-based identity model, we have an application called a relying party. An application needs to know who are the users. Now, you may be able to tell that application deals with users by provisioning. You may send up a text file, you may send it up a list and say, here's all the appropriate users. Now it knows who the users are. So now let's say a user contacts that application. So the user goes to the relying party application with their web browser, and the relying party says, okay, I don't know who you are. You're just a random HTTP client. I need you to have some claims. The relying party will redirect the user back to our identity provider, where the identity provider will go and authenticate the user. If you're using Active Directory Federation services as your identity provider, ADFS authenticates the user based on Active Directory. So if the user is already authenticated to their local domain, if they're running, let's say, on a domain joined machine, all that's taken care of for them automatically. If they're coming in from the extranet, ADFS can pop up a form that says, what's your username, what's your password, authenticate the user. The identity provider then, once it's authenticated the user, builds up a set of claims. You can pull claims from AD, you can pull claims from other sources. You get the claims bundled together in a token, encrypt it, sign it, what have you, send it to the relying party. The relying party now has a collection of claims that are effectively the attributes about the user that the relying party needs that the identity provider builds for them. And there's plenty of talks here at Microsoft about this model that walks through it in more detail. I'm just using that as introduction to now think about where do those claims come from? The Magic Claims Fairy, or do we have various databases and directories? So when you're using ADFS, you can only use Active Directory to authenticate the user. That's a limitation of ADFS as implemented today. If you want to use something else to authenticate the user, RSA Secure ID tokens or Sun Directory, then you would basically, that's a developer experience. You can build a custom authentication on top of ADFS, but that's not an out-of-the-box scenario. What you can do, however, without doing a lot of custom new development, is you can bring in attributes from other sources in order to create that set of claims. Active Directory, ADLDS, SQL are supported out of the box, and you can plug in additional claim sources. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, here's the reason. Within on-premises applications, historically, when you deployed a new application, and the application says, yes, fully 100% Active Directory compliant. Say, great, I'm going to run this application. The first thing it's going to give you the schema file says, here are the schema changes you need to make into your Active Directory deployment in order to support this new application. You give this to your Active Directory administrator. They look at it for a while, sign, roll that out across all your domains. Then you have to go populate all that data in Active Directory, replicate it, back it up, and so on. You've probably spent months doing that for Exchange. Every new application that shows up that's AD aware, you have to go make those schema changes for whatever attributes that application needs. And let's think about these claims-based applications. They could be running on premises, they could be running in the cloud. They don't talk to Active Directory directly. They're not LDAP clients. They're claims-aware clients. They use SAML and they use OAuth and they use WS Federation and other protocols. And they need these claims. If you go and tell your Active Directory administrator, if you're the Active Directory administrator and someone comes to you and says, I want you to go into Active Directory and modify the schema for this new application. Oh, by the way, this application, it's not even going to talk to Active Directory. It's not an LDAP client. I just need you to put the data there because you're a big data barge, and I want you to carry this data around. After a while, after deploying a few of these applications, you may say, okay, we're tired of doing schema modifications to AD for applications that aren't even AD-based. So what you can do is say, I want to put my claims for these new applications somewhere else. Maybe I'm going to put them in AD LDS. That's certainly a valid scenario. Maybe I'm going to put them in a SQL database. If you have an additional source, you just need to find some key, UPN, email address, domain and account name, whatever happens to be, between the user in Active Directory and the user in some other data source, a SQL table, AD LDS. Now when someone comes and says, hey, I've just signed up for this great new cloud-based application, foobar.com, and it needs this claim, is a foobar power user. Can you put this in Active Directory and populate everyone? They'll say, no, we're not going to put it in Active Directory. We're going to put it somewhere else. So let's go through a scenario. Let's say I'm a small organization. I've got a single domain. I've got ADFS. And someone shows up with this application and says, my application needs 2 claims. I need to know the username. OK, I've got that in Active Directory already. That's easy enough. And I need to know the user's role in this application. I need to know if they're an administrator of Contoso Web Application 1. OK, we don't have that data in Active Directory today. I don't want to go to Active Directory and make that change. Instead, I'm going to go to SQL. I'm going to create a SQL table, and I'm going to put that data in SQL, and I'm going to join it with the data in Active Directory. And so I'm going to use data coming out of SQL in order to make it available to my application. Now, the next part of it is, well, how does that data get into SQL? Where does it come from? How do I give the same view of that data as the data I have in AD? And this is where you can use FIM. So now let's switch over and show you a live demo. Whoa. OK. So what we've done, here's my SQL database, more claims. And my more claims has an ID column, the UPN, that's my key, and I've created a column for this new claim that Web Application 1 wants, Web App Role. So these are my 3 columns. Within Forefront Identity Manager, I can customize the schema of the users. So I can go into administration, schema, take a look at, where is it? Next page. Click at user, and the bindings. So if I look at the bindings for the user, I've got all the standard attributes. Some of them are in AD. I can also go and I can extend these out for additional attributes like web application, so on, that aren't going to be in Active Directory. These are just attributes that are within FIM itself. So now I have an attribute that's within the FIM schema. It's not within the Active Directory schema. I can then define a synchronization rule. If I go back to FIM, I can define how do I get that data into the database. In the old days, like 2007, when I was using ILM, I'd have to actually go and write code for that. Now it's a little bit easier. I have a synchronization rule that basically says, for all my users, when the user shows up, I can create a row for them in this more claims database. The UPN is my unique identifier. I can join that. And I can populate my FIM attribute, web app one role, into the web app one role column in that database. So now the users have the UPN and the web application role. The other thing that I can do within FIM is I can provide a self-service experience. So I can customize using the resource control display configuration, or RCDC, of Forefront Identity Manager, the user experience. So let's say I've got my users here. I can pick a user These tabs up here, general work info, contact, and so on, are built-in tabs by FIM. I've added a new tab called Web Application Role, and I can provide a drop-down, let's say. Here, this web application only needs to know two values, none or doesn't matter, or admin. So I can provide an experience using FIM for users to find out what their role is. I could provide an experience to allow users to request to be an administrator. I could use FIM workflows to control who needs to approve those changes. Or I could automatically provision users with that attribute based on, let's say, is they're coming in with a particular title or particular department. However it happens, FIM can then take that information and it populates that into the SQL database. So now let's see what happens over in Active Directory Federation services. In ADFS, I've configured that there are two sources for information, AD and my more claims database. And all I have to do in ADFS is tell it what server, what database, how to authenticate it. The actual work comes when I configure the relying party application. So here I've told ADFS I have this new relying party application called Web App 1, and I give it a claims rule. 3 rules for building claims for that application. The first is the display name that comes from Active Directory is going to be the name claim for that application. So it can say, welcome Chad, welcome Mark, whatever it happens to be. I need account name, UPN, and so on. I need to get those information, those attributes out of Active Directory so I can use it to join up to my table. The third rule, this is where it gets a little bit hairy, is a custom claim rule that says, issue a claim when I see a claim coming in that's a UPN claim. Then I'm going to issue one by going to my more claims store, which is my SQL database. I'm going to construct a claim that's the type role. How I'm going to do it is a SQL query that now starts to look a little bit normal. Select from where UPN equals and is not null with my UPN. So this is how I do the join. I get the UPN for the user coming in for Active Directory, and every time a user is redirected back to ADFS to build claims, ADFS will evaluate this rule and perform a SQL query against that database and pull the column out. So if I'm an administrator, it's going to go and it's going to read the Web App 1 role admin value and put it in as a claim value. You may ask yourself, what happens if there's more than one role with the same UPN? Answer, you get the same claim multiple times, same claim type, multiple values. So if your roles are admin and super admin and extra double secret admin all in your table, then you're going to get 3 claims, all with the same role claim, but with each one of the values. So this is basically selecting all of them. You're going to get 3 rows in that case and 3 claims out. Here, each user has just 1 row, so you're only going to get at most 1 out. Possibly for users like Kim or Melissa or Kevin, because their value is null, they're just not going to have a role claim at all. So that's how we map the claim. How do we use the claim? So over here, I built a web application using ASP.NET, and my web application is pretty straightforward. All it does is it prints out the claims. How did I write this? Let me show you the code. So within the ASP.NET page, I have a label, run that server. The code behind for that says, get all the claims, put them into the label. So now let's look at the actual identity part of that. Simple bit of code here. This code, you can widely find this snippet on the web. Here's all you have to do to get the claims in the application. Thread that current principal, cast it to a claims principal, extract the identity from it, and then you get an array of claims. So what will happen is, when I go to this application, if I were to hit refresh, like that, it'll go and it'll redirect me back to ADFS. ADFS evaluates each of these rules, gets the data from Active Directory, gets my UPN, uses my UPN to join up the data from the SQL database. And as we wait for the ADFS, here we're bouncing off ADFS. Now we bounce back to the application, and we see we get the role claim value from the database. So what's the point of all this? The point of all this is my screen is stuck. Demo. Do I have slides? No slides. Oh well. Okay. Let's advance past this then. Forward. Okay. So I'll just skip past this demo. Didn't skip earlier. That's the demo you would have seen had the virtual machines not been working. But you also get all these slides so you can read them later on the plane. Okay. So now we're back to the slides. So wrap up. What was the purpose in doing all this? FIM helps you get the data you need in Active Directory to enable cloud services. It helps you by doing the one-time check. You're about to deploy Office 365 or a cloud-based application. You need data to be sufficiently clean that Thurston can send it to the cloud. Secondly, it's going to help with the day-to-day management. We've talked about a number of scenarios that you can do with FIM out of the box today with self-service to enable self-service virtual machine management by putting people into the right security groups that they then have access to virtual machines. You can also think about using this for managing groups, for Exchange Online, for SharePoint Online. And most excitingly, we've talked about how we can use FIM to put data into additional claim sources, databases, directories, and so on, that are then turned by ADFS into claims for web-based applications. So what's the value for this? What is the purpose for doing this? The reason for this is I think that for the next wave of applications coming out there, the things that the ISV community are building today, they're not going to be building AD on-premises applications that are LDAP clients. They're going to be applications that are going to be runnable in the cloud as software as a service. They're going to be applications that are going to be deployed as virtual machines. And they're going to expect to get either a feed of records. Give me a listing of all the users who've been added or deleted, or they're going to be claims-aware applications. Either one of those, you're going to need to think about how do I provision to this new category of applications that aren't going to be AD-aware. You're also going to think about if those applications are federation capable. If they're using WSFed or SAML or OAuth, how do I get the data that those applications need? Many of the applications that are becoming claims-aware today need additional claims in order to operate properly that aren't attributes you already have in AD. They need the name and the account name and attributes like that, but they're also going to need application-specific claims. And you don't want to have to keep modifying Active Directory for every new application. Someone might buy an application and say, yeah, I want to try it for 3 months and then turn it off. I don't want to populate all my AD systems, all my domains, just for this pilot. With FIM, you can provide an experience so that users can go have additional attributes, manage their attributes. You can use FIM to control how they get those values, how they go into a SQL database, as we've seen with FIM. ADFS can read that data, turn it into claims for enabling those applications. And there's a number of talks. We have a talk coming right after this later today where we're going to be talking more about Forefront Identity Manager Release 2, which adds some new capabilities, and some will help with these scenarios. Others are for more on-premises scenarios. We also have a talk later this week on Thursday morning about how do we optimize FIM for our larger scale deployments. There's also going to be an interactive talk specifically around some of the new password reset capabilities tomorrow morning with FIM. We also have a talk later this evening where if you have questions about FIM more generally, you can ask us then. We have a hands-on lab version of this, so you saw some of my slides flash by and you saw my demo. If you want to try this yourself, there's a hands-on lab, SIM 399, where you can do claims authentication management with FIM. And you can come talk to us in the exhibit hall. All right, well, thank you very much. Any questions? Fill out your evaluations, and if not, I'll see you in a later talk today.